Come on then, ladies and gentlemen. Well, that's what you are, is it not? Do you want me to call you something else? Guys and dolls? No, you're alright, you're okay. Our speaker's gone to the loo anyway. I was just calling you to order. Susanna, Gold Star, sitting on the front row. And Jean and Joe, yeah, very good. Steady. Reminds me of one of my clergy, not in this chapter, in another chapter. If he went to a meeting there and someone went off to the loo, she would go into this state of embarrassment because they would go to the loo, they would flush the chain, and then after a while the pipes would start rattling and there'd be all sorts going on, and she'd be no. Anyway, that didn't happen for Richard, actually.
My pipes would have been rattling.
Absolutely. Well, that's an interesting thought to carry into prayer, isn't it? Let's just spend a moment or two in prayer. Father, we thank you for this time together as we continue on our journey through Lent. We thank you for each other. And especially this evening we thank you for Richard and pray for him as he speaks to us. And as you have been with us as we've learned more your presence in different strands of life, we pray you might bless us this evening as we seek to know more of your presence in the life of our diocese, in our schools, and in education. This we ask in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. So I've got here, I'm going to introduce you to Richard Noak, who is the Diocesan Director of Education. It's a great title, isn't it? And it's not an insignificant title. I've got a little bit about Richard here, which he may tell you, and I don't want to tell you too much more about him. I'll leave you to him. But just before, we have 242 church schools in this diocese now, which is massive, as you know, and the 65,000 children, which is the largest number in the whole country, even more than Oxford, which is going something because Oxford's a really big diocese. So it's a considerable task which he has as Director of Education, which he began in 2015. Prior to then, he'd been Head of Theology, Religion and Philosophy, and the Director of the Centre for Church School Education in York, I guess, based in York. Yeah. So that was a pretty impressive job that saw him travel the world, and prior to then, he had a background in education, was a teacher, teaching RE, and has a connection with Middlesbrough, which is Alison. So, all that said, it just gives you a little bit of a sense of where Richard's come from, but I'll hand you over to him. So welcome, Richard.
Here with you. Thank you for the welcome, Matthew. My first visit to St Mary's Church Hall. Not been to the church either, but good to be here with you. I'm conscious that I'm being filmed and recorded. That always makes one slightly nervous in case what one says at one point in time is then held against you in the future. So I shall be very circumspect about the things that I'm going to say. The title, well, clearly the title for your Lent course has been What Has God Got to Do with Education? education. So a few words that maybe aren't going to be that profound, but at least will root that question into a biblical context. And then I'm going to say a little bit about education in the Diocese of Leeds, a little bit about church schools in the Diocese of Leeds, something around the diocese vision for education and how that links into a national Church of England vision for education, and then an opportunity for you to ask some questions, which might be, do you know every one of the 65,000 children in your schools? And the answer is no, not all of them. Okay. If I were to start with what has God got to do with education, then I might start with a bit of scripture from John chapter 10 verse 10. And that particular verse is text that is used by Christian educators when they talk about God's commitment to the task of education. So you may well know it. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full, or whatever version rings true for you. Sometimes it's, I've come that people may have life in abundance. I think that education is perceived, hopefully, by more than those who are engaged in the task of education and schooling as having something to do with wholeness of life. I am led to believe there are some current and former educationalists in the audience, so I'm hoping that that rings true for you in terms of your commitment to education as something to do with the wholeness of life, and education as contributing to the fulfilling of each individual person's full human flourishing. In a sense, without the educative task, we are perhaps something less than we might be if we have not engaged with education. Now, education, of course, is a very broad idea, and it's more than schooling. The work of the Board of Education in the diocese might be perceived by some to be limited to the narrowness that is church school education. It isn't. The role of the Board of Education in the diocese, in any diocese, is to do with constructing a notion of a vision for education across the whole of the diocese. And if we understand the diocese as being all those people that live within the geographical area that is the diocese, then clearly we are talking about much more than those who attend church and those who attend church schools. For me, education in the Diocese of Leeds is yes about church schools, it's about all children accessing education in any context. It's about the commitment of the diocese to support Christians who are involved in education. It's also about the commitment from the diocese to support further and higher education, and also something to do with chaplaincy within school contexts. That's kind of the breadth of what the Board of Education engages with in any diocese. Whilst I would expect that there is a fairly universal agreement that being educated is a good thing, we do know, do we not, that for some social groups, education is in fact more than just a good thing. It can be the liberating experience that transforms their lives. I would argue that should be the case for everybody who has an education experience. But certainly for some social groups, education transforms their lives and helps them to expand beyond what their current context maybe offers them. The Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, you may have heard of him, he was a particular influence on my understanding of education back in the late 70s and early 80s as I was training to be a teacher. Paulo Freire dedicated his life to literacy projects in Brazil. He founded these literacy projects and he worked with Campesino Indians in the favelas of Brazil, and in teaching those Campesino Indians to read and write, he did more than just teach them to read and write. He taught them not only to read the word, but also to be able to read the world. And in teaching them, he gave them access to the full political system in their country, because at that time, illiterate people were not allowed to vote. They were the done unto people in Brazil, who had no way of transforming or changing their context because they could not engage in the political process. Education as liberation, and education as a very political act. So Freire's work is work which is drawn on by many educators, not just because he enabled those Campesino Indians to become literate, but because it teaches us that education is a very political act. That is true within whatever context we live and work, and wherever we ply our trade as educationalists. We cannot talk about the curriculum in this country for compulsory maintained schooling without understanding that there is a political agenda at play within what happens within schools and broadly within government policy, of course. One important thing that Freire offered to those Campesino Indians in teaching them to read was they then had full access to the Bible. And in doing so, their lives were even more transformed because they could actually read those biblical stories and see in their own lives where that played out in reality. And the work of Freire was very influential in the development of liberation theology in South America, which has had a transformative approach to theology throughout the whole of the world. And in fact, for me, as an educationalist and a theologian and a religionist, the work of liberation theology is also something that I've drawn on for the 30-odd years of my professional life. Freire's book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, outlines his method and the profound impact that literacy had upon those Campesino Indians in Brazil. So I think if we can accept that education is a transformational and liberating activity that can change the lives of individuals and communities for the better, then we surely can see the act of educating as being part of God's plan for the lives of each individual person. And possibly we can see the educator as fulfilling a vocation and engaging, I would argue, in a form of ministry. And for me, as a teacher, I believe I have been called into that profession, and I do strongly believe that what I have done for the last 30-odd years in my life, in my professional life, is in fact a form of Christian ministry. I find that that is the case for many Christians who are engaged in education. I am blessed by being the Director of Education to sit round the Bishop's staff table maybe at this point we need to turn this on. And we often have conversations around the bishop's staff table about vocation. And it's interesting that when you sit with 6 bishops and 5 archdeacons and 3 deans of cathedrals and 2 diocesan secretaries, at that point I usually say a party to the patron, that vocation is seen in a rather narrow sense as being putting a collar around your neck, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I often have to say, let us not forget that for some Christians their vocation is to teach, and that should be seen as an active ministry that they are carrying out. So I just offer that to you this evening. So that's the kind of profound bit out of the way, if you would like to think of it in that way. A few words then about the Church's involvement in education. Some of you may know that the Church of England has been involved in education as a provider of education going back over hundreds of years, but in a formal and managed sense back to 1811, when one Joshua Watson began, along with a couple of colleagues, what was known then as the National Society for the Promotion of Religious Education. The National Society still exists. It is a central plank within the mission and ministry strategy of the Church of England. Today, the National Society, in common parlance terms, is known as the Church of England Education Office. They kind of rebadged themselves a couple of years ago. But the National Society brought about the development of compulsory, but definitely full schooling opportunities for all children. Not just for the rich and the privileged, but provided education for what was called the deserving poor. So from 1811 onwards, the Church of England was providing schooling for primary age children and building church schools. And by the late 1830s and into the 1840s, the Anglican Church then began to build teacher training colleges to train teachers to teach in those church schools. I am a product of one of those church colleges, as was the College of Ripon in York St John, now known as the University of York St John, and that's where I ended up going back to work for 20 odd years in teacher education and as head of theology and religious studies, and I never envisaged that would be the case. So the Church of England has been involved in providing education to the nation for a considerable amount of time. And 50 years before the state engaged in it, so let's not forget that either. So we have a long history within the Church of England of engagement with formal schooling, and that's something we should be proud of. We continue in this country to have something like a third of the schools nationally in England being church schools. And the Church of England, therefore, has a very significant voice into education and schooling and into government. And that's something which, as DDE, I engage with on a very regular basis. One of my responsibilities will be to network with the 38 other people that do my job in Church of England Diocese, to meet with the Church of England Education Office, to meet with senior government ministers, and to talk about education policy and strategy, and where we need to put some challenge into the system and say, are you really sure this is what we should be doing? So we have a significant role, I would say, still within the Church of England in terms of national policy for education. And the Church of England Education Office over the last few years has worked extremely hard to put a commentary back into the system, which is a challenge to some extent against perhaps what we might call a drift to a metric system where everything is tables, league tables and tick boxes, and quite a narrow approach to the curriculum, we might argue. Now, part of that has been the development of the Academies programme, and we might want to ask some questions. We'll talk about that in a bit. That's entirely up to you. I do an awful lot of work working in the Academies programme. But the Church of England Education Officer, through its Chief Officer, Reverend Nigel Genders, has been working very hard, as I say, to put a different narrative back into the system. Back in 2016, the Church of England produced a vision document, a vision for education, deeply Christian, serving the common good. Now, this vision document, you might think, as it's come from the Church of England Education Office, is about church schools within the system. It's not. It's a commentary into the system and to government and key stakeholders to say, let's not lose sight of what education and schooling should be all about. A holistic approach to education, and that school should be dealing with the wholeness of individuals, not just their literacy and their numeracy, as important as that is, but that it should be about a wholeness within education. And this vision document talks about education as being about 4 key areas. And I'm just going to share those with you. And I will give you to take away for homework a sheet, one side of A4 taken from this document that unpacks this in a little bit more detail. So the Church of England has been arguing that education should be about educating for wisdom, knowledge and skills. But note that word wisdom. Not a word that we often use these days, and certainly not within education, but an attempt to recapture that notion of education being about wisdom, which, if we look theologically and biblically at what we mean by wisdom, that term is a very deep and profound word. If we look in the Old Testament, we find wisdom literature. The notion that we need to become wise people. Yes, we might achieve that by being numerate and literate, but it's more than that. So the Church of England Education Vision talks about educating for wisdom, knowledge and skills. But it also talks about educating for hope and aspiration. I would argue that term hope, as we might understand it within a Christian understanding, is about something that is profound and that might be to come, but that we hold on to, that we believe in, that we see as being a vibrant possibility in the future and being able to be captured now. So if we were talking about the kingdom, our understanding of the kingdom as being realised now, but also something that will be in the future. And that in schools we need to be engaging children to be aspiring to the best that they can be. And that surely has to engage them in the liberal arts curriculum, in science, technology, engineering, maths, in performing arts, music, dance, drama. That is about the wholeness of life. And of course, sport. Never forget sport. The vision document also talks about educating for community and living well together. Now, this is something which the Church of England has been talking about in education for a couple of years, about the fact that we need to help children, young people and students to understand about the role that they play, not just as individuals, but as members of communities, and the importance of that to the wellness of society. And so the Church of England Education Office, working with its diocese and its education teams, has been doing quite a lot of work on what we call character education, and looking at how the wholeness of the curriculum should involve and entail something about character, about how we form good character, strong character, and how part of that is about how we learn to live well together, irrespective of our backgrounds, our gender, our age, our sexuality, and our beliefs. And some of what we're doing within church school education is to help schools to understand how people can live together but come from plural backgrounds. And I think that's a key factor within the work that we are trying to do. And the fourth area is about educating for dignity and respect, something that hopefully we all would agree is important in our modern plural society. So those are the four pillars of the Church of England's vision for education. And as I say, that isn't just for church schools. This is being talked about with government in terms of this is what education across all schools and academies should be about. I think that's really positive, and therefore within the Diocese of Leeds we've been focusing quite significantly on that vision document and working with schools to understand that better. Last year, 2017, our annual Head Teachers Conference focused on vision and leadership in church schools. And we did quite a little bit of work with those heads that came to that conference for to help them understand the vision document. As a result of that, the Board of Education within the Diocese of Leeds has produced its own vision for education, which draws on those four pillars and also takes seriously the Diocese of Leeds' notion of loving, living, learning. So we've interwoven those three key themes, value themes from the diocese with the vision document from the Church of England Education Office. And again, we've been doing quite a lot of work with our church schools to understand the Board of Education's vision and where that distinctive Diocese of Leeds flavour needs to come through in terms of church schools across the diocese. So, where are we in the Diocese of Leeds? Well, as Matthew said, the beast that has been created is a rather large one, with 2,500 square miles of diocese, as you will well know, going up to the A66 and beyond. So we have one school in County Durham, down into Barnsley, where we have 6 church schools in the Barnsley local authority, across into Lancashire, and taking in the whole of West Yorkshire and a significant chunk of North Yorkshire. 242 church schools, 64,500 children every day being educated in a church school, hopefully where the character and ethos is deeply Christian and where through that we are able to serve the common good. The work that we do emanating out of the Board of Education and through myself and my officers, my advisors, is very much about supporting schools in terms of their distinctively Church of England operation, but increasingly we are also having to support schools around their standards and school improvement priorities. It is the case that working across 9 local authorities as we do, that sadly some of our local authorities have diminished in size, they have much reduced funding, and they are not able to support schools within their authorities in a way that they might have done 5, 8, 10 years ago. Some of the authorities that we work with now have very, very small education teams. We are not resourced within the Board of Education to pick up the kind of work which the local authority would be doing. The local authority still has statutory functions in regards to its schools. What it doesn't necessarily have to do is provide support for the standards in our schools. That's where we would work with schools who perhaps are vulnerable and foreground support which they might get from a range of other stakeholders. The real challenge for us in the Diocese of Leeds and for any diocese is that inspection framework that we know as Ofsted. When Ofsted come knocking on a school's door, should that school not be successful and the school fall into what we call an Ofsted category, if it is a church school, then the Department for Education now come to the Director of Education in the diocese and say, Richard, one of your schools is failing, you must find a solution for it. They do not go to the local authority because in effect it is deemed the case that the local authority have failed that school if it has fallen into an Ofsted category. So I have a very, and I will say, a very strong and positive relationship with the Department for Education. And within the Diocese of Leeds, we are trisected by 3 regional school commission areas. The regional schools commissioners are people that have been put in post over the last few years by the government, initially to run the Academies programme, but now their powers are extended and expanded, and I have very regular meetings with them about all of the schools of the diocese, but particularly about those schools that are failing. So one of the significant responsibilities of the diocese is when a school has gone into an Ofsted category, that we find a solution for that school. And any school in an Ofsted category has to become an academy. Legally. It's written into law, but that is what has to happen. And so what we have had to do over the last few years is to develop an academy programme within the diocese to provide secure solutions for vulnerable church schools and to provide multi-academy trusts where schools are deciding that they no longer want to work in a local authority system but wish to become church school academies. That has been a significant amount of work since I came into post in January 15. I did work with the historic diocese in 14 on secondment from York St John University, fully expecting to go back to my ivory tower. God moves in mysterious ways. So that is a significant amount of work that we do within the diocese, and I cannot underestimate what the challenge is in terms of finding solutions. We have very strong and positive academy solutions in some areas of the diocese. And in other areas of the diocese we have very little provision. And over the last 2 years I've spent a lot of time creating new multi-academy trusts where the church is in the majority in terms of running those companies. Whilst that might seem like a very strange piece of work for the Director of Education to be involved in, I have to look at it positively and say, actually, I think we can see this as an opportunity for the church to be closer to those schools that become academies and go into multi-academy trusts, because we have the majority share in terms of running that company. So the significant governance structure in a multi-academy trust, which is the trust board, is appointed by the diocese. So we can ensure we put skilled, principled and quite probably Christian people onto those trust boards. The negative of that is that those roles are all voluntary roles. And I would also want to ask the question, as you may well too, isn't that an awful lot of responsibility to put onto the shoulders of individuals who are fulfilling a function but in a voluntary capacity? And I would say that is a significant challenge, and one where the diocese has to engage in supporting those people through training, conferences, events, etc. So we find ourselves in a mixed economy across the Diocese of Leeds, with over 50 of our schools now being church academies, with 10 multi-academy trusts where the church is in the majority in terms of member level. Still a significant number of schools that are maintained schools working with local authorities, where local authorities are diminished and can't really provide the kind of support that they once did to those schools. Last academic year, 78 schools, church schools, asked about becoming an academy. So that demonstrates to you that even those that don't have to are considering it as a possible future for themselves. And one of the challenges that I have is to try and keep some coherence around the way in which multi-academy trusts grow and develop. It wouldn't make sense, I don't think, to have a school in Barnsley join a multi-academy trust up in Richmond in North Yorkshire, because how would those collaborative opportunities work across that kind of distance? So sometimes I know that head teachers and chairs of governors will see me as a bit of a blocker, where I might say, I don't think the Board of Education would agree to you converting and joining that trust. Here are a number of options though that are more local that you might want to look at. What I can say is we're not doing what the Roman Catholics have now announced that they are going to do, and that isn't a negative comment about the Catholics at all. But my Roman Catholic colleagues across the Catholic Diocese of Leeds and the Catholic Diocese of Middlesbrough have told all of their Catholic schools, you will all convert to the academies, and this is the multi-academy trust that you will be part of. We haven't done that. We wouldn't have the power to do that, but that's not a message either that I think we will be sending out to our schools. We do a lot more than deal with the Academies programme in the Diocese of Leeds. There is a significant piece of new religious education curriculum entitled Understanding Christianity, which has been written for all schools, not just church schools, but where we are the registered trainers in this part of the country, and where now over 150 of our church schools are using this piece of curriculum material for RE. It's probably, and I've worked in RE 30 odd years, it's probably the best piece of curriculum project work that I've seen for many a long year, developed to introduce children to Christianity as a living tradition. And a lot of our schools are now using that, and we're doing a lot of training on that. Another area that we are involved in very significantly is preparing our church schools for a different kind of inspection, as an inspection of them as church schools, what we call the statutory inspection of Anglican and Methodist schools framework. So within a 5-year period, every church school will be inspected under that framework, as well as expecting an Ofsted inspection. That's where a lot of our work in the diocese takes place, in terms of ensuring that schools understand what the framework is, how it operates, and that they are ready for that kind of an inspection framework. That's where people like you are very significant, because part of what church schools should be doing is engaging with their local community and their local parish. That obviously means you lot. What we would like to do is to help congregations to understand what their role and their responsibilities might be for working with their local church schools if they have one on their patch. And we are looking to roll out some training into the future to help parishes to understand that. The Church of England Education Office, who are responsible for that framework, that inspection framework, have decided it's time to rewrite it. Oh joy. And from September of this year, schools being inspected will be inspected under a brand new inspection framework. So my advisors have all been engaged in training for that, and we are now rolling out that training to our church schools. As you can imagine, those schools who know that they are probably in the window for inspection in the next 12 months are coming to that training and taking very, very detailed notes about what it might look like. And we are working with them to help them to understand the impact of that in their school context. What is significant is that a lot of the language of the new SIAMS, Statutory Inspection of Anglican Methods, SIAMS framework is built on this document, Vision for Education, deeply Christian, serving the common good. So we feel quite smug in the diocese that last year our annual Head Teachers Conference was all about this, and now the new framework is very much foregrounding the ideas contained in this document. Speaking of annual conferences, we had this academic year's conference on Friday last week. We moved from Rudding Park in Harrogate, where we'd had the conference for a few years, and we had it at the Queen's Hotel in Leeds, on the station. The impact of that, and this shows you the challenges of a large diocese, is that we picked up far more schools from Huddersfield, Wakefield, Barnsley, Leeds, Bradford, who had never come to Head Teachers Conference before, and we lost all our schools from Richmondshire and the Danes, who decided that Leeds was a very long way away and they weren't going to trek into the middle of Leeds for a conference. Nevertheless, we had 140 schools represented at conference on Friday, and we had Bishop Stephen Conway, the Bishop of Ely, who's the chair of the National Society and the voice for education in the Lords for the Church of England. And we had one or two other speakers come and talk to us about schools, transforming lives, transforming communities, which again picks up very much on the National Vision Framework, our own Board of Education vision, the language of signs, but also, if you know the Diocese of Leeds strategy in some detail, you will know that the Diocese of Leeds talks about confident Christians, growing churches, transforming communities. So we're also trying to foreground the extent to which what we do in education is part of the whole mission and ministry of the diocese, because it certainly is that. I argue around Bishop's staff table and in another fora that having 242 church schools provides a golden opportunity for the church to have a transformational relationship with those children, those teachers in that church school, their parents and carers and extended family. It really does provide that opportunity. And I believe that so passionately, we've begun to do some research around how local parishes are making the best opportunity of having a church school on their patch. And we're getting some quite profound responses in terms of the way in which parish and church school are working together to extend that notion of transforming lives and transforming communities. So it felt right that our conference this year should focus on that as a theme. And there will be more coming out from the Education Office to people like Matthew to encourage work within parishes, to work alongside schools, and to really help in that holistic approach to education. So, I have come that they may have life and have it in abundance. I argue that education is a significant contributor to the notion of people having full, abundant lives. That's where I see God is involved in and is interested in education, and why my professional life has been a vocation and a ministry in terms of my Christian commitment. Thank you. I've got two documents, two bits of homework. One is a page which unpacks a little bit more on wisdom, hope, community and dignity, and the other is actually the Board of Education's vision for education, so you can take that away.
So should we do as we normally do? We've got a couple of minutes to turn and talk to your neighbour, think about stuff that's come to mind from it, and then we'll have a chance to ask Richard some questions. I've written some down.
Read dyslexic, it's like it's back at the class, it's all over to something. But then I can give it, I didn't give it, I can give it medicine. That's what being dyslexic was all But if you're there, you can't say those
Right, folks, we've got a few minutes, so who wants to kick us off? Question, observation? Oh, Tony's up. Hello.
Tony,
Richard.
be kind to me.
We said learn the word. We understand that. That's a very for the academy. Learn the world. So that means learn about life and way to live. But you forgot to say that in education in state schools for over 30 years, learn the community. You need to understand what the aspirations are from the parents and for the people of the community. Now, if you miss that altogether, you're missing something out. You're narrowing the children to your academic way or your way. Now, I worked in South Leeds for 26 years actually, and one of the things that the community wanted was sport.
Yes.
They really did. Hunslet was, well, they grew up with a rugby ball in their hands. So I think learning the community is a vital thing.
Yeah. I certainly wouldn't disagree with you. I'd be silly to, wouldn't I? But I wouldn't disagree with you at all. I think that notion of community is certainly written through the Church of England vision document, and you'll find it very much coming through the Board of Education for Leeds as well. Sport's a really interesting one, because when we talk about the development of the spiritual, which is what the 1988 Education Reform Act for England talked about, that the curriculum should develop, one of the things being the spiritual. It never defined what it meant by the spiritual, but it said that it should be developed. What we often forget is that the spiritual can often be developed through sport. And certainly that notion of community and living well together is certainly developed through sporting activity. I enjoyed sport. I'd say I also enjoyed music and drama and dance. And as long as you don't repeat it beyond this room, what I do to relax is I perform on stage in musical theatre. And again, I think that's a spiritual activity as well. So if you want to see me in that pursuit, come to Harrogate Theatre at the end of April, where I'm performing in Guys and Dolls. Oh, I'll sing.
Come to the Grand in April and see Cats.
Trevor.
Is it just a matter of time then before all schools become academies and you're really just fighting against the waves that are eventually going to come in and swamp you?
That's the $64,000 question, really. We were in a position back in May 2016 where the then Education Secretary, Nicky Morgan, was pushing to have put within legislation that every school would have to become an academy. And it was at that point that the Board of Education in Leeds was developing its strategy for academisation. And I was saying to the board, it's looking like all schools are going to have to become academies. So we really need to have a strategy and know what we're doing about how we do that, how we cope with it in such a large context. I'd did 15 road shows around the diocese, talking to schools, governors, etc. about the Academies programme and the strategy that we thought we were going to adopt in Leeds and how we would develop some new multi-academy trusts, and if there were any schools that felt they wanted to be first in, come and talk to me. And it was literally on a Friday afternoon when I'd finished the second input of 2 on one day at a school in Harrogate. People filed out, and then half of them came running back in, and I went, "What are you doing? Go away, I want to go get a tea." They said, "Oh, it's all finished, the Academies programme, it's all finished. Look, there's a statement here. Government rowed back on Academies agenda." So for about 48 hours I thought, oh, that's our strategy up the Swanee, that's no good, is it? The road shows the week after, I didn't change any slide and I didn't change my narrative. I just said, it looks like the government may not put into legislation that we all have to become academies, but there are still a significant number of bear traps that are set to catch schools out. The most significant being, if you fall into an Ofsted category, you have to become an academy. And by that, you have to join a multi-academy trust. Now, if the diocese is not doing its job properly, then it will just let those schools go to the dogs, frankly. But we've been very proactive and we've helped to develop a number of trusts so that we have solutions. The Department for Education will not allow a failing school to go into a multi-academy trust unless there is capacity within that trust to support that school. So I have had to ask in a general way for schools that are strong, that are good, that are outstanding, to contemplate becoming an academy, to join a multi-academy trust, to provide the capacity within the trust to support those vulnerable schools. To me, that feels like a gospel kind of thing to do, but I know it's also messing with the old system and playing into the hands of a government policy that, frankly, I might not be quite in agreement with. But I've had to go from my idealistic position to a practical, rational, pragmatic position that this is what we are having to do. Now, your question was, are all schools going to have to become academies? I think that some schools who are strong are saying, we'll sit this one out, see whether we can survive. Whilst they're doing that, it's quite likely that more and more schools round about them are going, oh, local authority's not there to support us much anymore. Perhaps it would be best to become an academy and join a multi-academy trust. My concern is that we'll end up with some schools that kind of don't jump and then are left a little bit blowing in the wind. So I have to be very careful. I'm not saying to schools you must become an academy. I have to say there'll be a mixed economy over the next 5, 6, 7 years. I think gradually more and more schools will become an academies and we probably will reach that tipping point. We've reached it for secondary schools. 78% of secondary schools nationally are now academies. About 28% of primaries are. Over the next few years, we will undoubtedly have another 20, 30 primary schools becoming academies. We then begin to reach that point of, well, those that aren't are either so strong as individuals that they don't need to. I would argue there's no school like that, to be honest. Or they will gradually join multi-academy trusts. So I can see that we may well get to. Of course, we've had a change of Secretary of State. Justin Greening, who took over from Nicky Morgan, was not particularly interested in the expansion of the Academies programme. Neither was she interested in the expansion of the grammar school system either. But Damien Hines, who's come in, is both pro-selection and we understand very pro-academies and would dearly like to push the Academies programme harder. What, of course, a minority government doesn't have is the power to push that kind of stuff through. So we're in a bit of a stalemate at the moment, I would say. The next election could be a real clincher. you know, if Conservative got a majority, I think they'll push again. Sorry, long answer to
No,
the
no,
short
that's
question.
thank you.
The new Damien, the current secretary, is also very, very firmly in favour of faith school.
Yeah.
Do you see that as perhaps being too strong an attitude?
Nicky Morgan is very positive about faith schools as well. Justin Greening not so much so. A bit of government policy as well as selective education is to allow faith schools to select more children on the grounds of faith. That's a perennial question into the church, both Anglican and other religious traditions around selection. My own personal take on selection on the grounds of faith is I strongly believe that Church of England schools are schools for the local community, that they are part of serving the common good. They are the church's gift to the local community, and that in some contexts around the diocese we have schools which are 90% British, Asian, Muslim heritage. And I see no incongruence with that and church school education, because I think it is about that strength of ethos and character that is a gift to the local community. So I wouldn't particularly advocate church schools operating a selection on the grounds of faith. However, I do think that possibly within a secondary context, that is still appropriate, particularly if you look at the place where some church secondary schools are located in affluent areas, where actually it could end up with those who can afford to live in that area getting access to a church school education, and those who are in poorer communities not then being able to access a secondary church school education. That is certainly the case with a school like St Aidan's in Harrogate and with Abbey Grange School in Leeds, where Abbey Grange School pulls from 60 odd schools across the city of Leeds, and their demographic is very, very plural and diverse. And St Aidan's in Harrogate again pulls from across the whole of Harrogate and the Ripon Archdeaconry, and by virtue of that they do have a more diverse school population. So that's where I would still probably argue that we should maintain that option, but I do actually personally feel most schools probably don't need to have selection criteria based on faith, particularly primary schools, I would argue.
Okay, well, it is that time, isn't it? It's kind of 25 to 9. So let me, on our behalf, express our thanks to Richard for coming here this evening. Thank you. End of his day, got to go back to Ripon. You're very welcome to join us for Compline, should you wish to. Chill out, you know, before the Almighty and all that. But, you know, you can chill out on your way back to Ripon as well if you wish. But just to thank him for being with us. He's a busy man and he has a lot to do. And as before, we say, you go with our love and our prayers. So thank you for being with us.